Hi, I'm Emily Ratajkowski, and I'm endorsing Bernie Sanders for president.
So in case you're not familiar with who Emily Ratajkowski is, she's a swimsuit model for the Sports Illustrated Bikini magazine. And I think what's going on here is that Bernie Sanders wants to try to appeal to young men. And what better way to do that than to have a young, attractive swimsuit model advocate for your campaign? Which makes sense. I mean, the phrase sex sells applies to politics as much as it does any other aspect of life. So before we get into the crux of the video, I want to quickly take a look at the t-shirt that she's wearing for a brief period of time at the beginning. You see, wearing a t-shirt or having any other sort of text in the background with a political message on it is a very common strategy often used in order to get a point across without actually having to argue for it. This is why whenever I'm responding to a video that has these subtle political messages in the background, I like to take a second to stop and deconstruct them. Anyways, her t-shirt is somewhat difficult to read since part of it's being obscured by her hair, but given the context of what Bernie Sanders tends to campaign for, it's not difficult to infer what that t-shirt says. College for all, Medicare for all, jobs for all, and justice for all. And it's here that we get sort of a sampling of the naivete and fundamental lack of economic understanding that Bernie's whole platform is built upon. It would be nice to live in a world where we could just grant universal access to things as a right, such as education and healthcare, but the reality of it is that at the end of the day, these things do require resources to be provided, and those resources have to come from somewhere. Usually this means that you're forced to pay for it through your taxes, so it ends up not being so free after all. But anyways, let's go down the list. First is college for all. If people are entitled college as a universal right, that naturally raises a lot of questions. How much and what kind of college are you entitled to? Should only the first 4 years of your college education be paid for? Or should you be able to get a master's and PhD on the state dime? Should you have to go to a local community college in order to save money? Or if someone wants to go to the most expensive Ivy League school in the country, should the state just pay for that? Should only tuition be covered? Or should things like textbooks and studying materials be covered too? What if someone wants to live on campus, get a meal plan with a cafeteria, or do a semester abroad in another country? Should the government cut them a check for that as well? What about someone like me, who was able to graduate from college without a single penny in debt? I had to work really hard and make a lot of sacrifices to make that happen. Would it be fair to force me to subsidize someone else's frat parties or semesters in Europe so they could get their worthless gender studies degree? Next is Medicare for all. There's a lot of problems with Bernie Sanders' supposed healthcare plan, which I'll touch on later in the video. For now, if you want a quick crash course on what the problems are with socialized healthcare, check out Shane Killian's video, How to Argue for Universal Healthcare. Link will be in the description. Next, jobs for all. There's some confusion among the left among what a job is actually meant to be. A job is simply a means to creating wealth, not an end in of itself. For example, suppose the government told every unemployed person that we'll pay you to dig holes and fill them back up all day. Would that create jobs? Sure. Would that reduce unemployment? Again, it would. But is anything being accomplished? Is the economy being more productive? Are lives being improved? And I think the most ironic thing about this claim in particular is that if you know anything about Bernie Sanders' campaign, like at all, you'll know that a lot of the things he advocates for actually destroy jobs. For example, he wants to spike the minimum wage to $15 an hour. If businesses have to pay their employees that much, there's a good chance they're not going to hire as many people. And finally, justice for all. It's pretty easy to use a vague and pleasant sounding word to try and appeal to as many people as possible, because justice is one of those things that everyone agrees is good but doesn't exactly agree on what it is. But anyways, to the left-wing Bernie Sanders types, to them, justice usually means forcing other people to pay for your free shit.
I'm 28. I'm a millennial, a true millennial.
If you're 28 years old as of 2020, you're probably more like Gen Z.
You know, I think one of the things that's so interesting about young people supporting Bernie Sanders.
So I'm going to be straight up and honest with you about this. The only reason that Bernie Sanders gets all the support from young people that he does is for the simple fact that young people are more naive about reality and economics. So when Uncle Bernie promises them free shit, they're less likely to critically think about where that free shit's going to come from or how realistic it would be to actually provide. This is why most Bernie Sanders supporters are young people, and why Bernie Sanders specifically targets his campaign towards younger people. Young people are more naive about economics. Bernie knows it, and that's what his whole campaign is built around.
Is that he's not like a young, sexy candidate.
Well, he's certainly not a young candidate. The dude's in his late 70s, and has had to actually cancel multiple campaign events due to medical conditions regarding his age. As far as sexy, you never know. Some women are into older gentlemen. There's actually a term, silver fox, that's used to describe handsome older gentlemen. So I don't know, maybe some women are into older men, I don't know. Sexy is a little more subjective, but he's definitely old.
What he says speaks so much to what people want.
Yeah, that's kind of the problem with Bernie Sanders. He promises people what they want and not necessarily what's realistic. I'm sure it's pretty easy to gain support by just promising free shit. You know, vote for me and you'll get free healthcare, free education, free housing, free pet unicorns, free this, free that. I'm sure it would be easy for anyone to gain support by just promising free stuff. The problem, though, is that while he spends a lot of time promising you all this free stuff, he's not quite spending as much time explaining to you where that free stuff's going to come from, or discussing how realistic it would be to provide all this stuff for free. Making promises is easy, anyone can make promises. Actually delivering on those promises, however, is a bit more tricky.
That sort of who he is, it's so much beyond just one man. Bernie is extremely genuine, he's consistent.
Bernie Sanders is genuine and consistent. Are you sure about that? This is the guy who laments rich people being greedy, all the while being a multimillionaire, owning multiple homes, and giving less than 0.3% of his income to charity. There are a lot of words I'd use to describe Bernie Sanders, but neither genuine nor consistent would come to mind.
He's powerful, not because of who he is as one person, but because of the way that he invigorates people and excites them.
Again, the way that Bernie Sanders invigorates and excites people is by promising them free shit, not telling them where it's going to come from. Like, anyone could invigorate and excite people by doing that.
And brings together this movement.
Larken Rose mentions this in his video, in which he makes fun of Joe Biden's inaugural speech. But you can't bring people together by initiating violence. When politicians tax or regulate people, that's one group of people benefiting at the expense of another. It's not a mutually beneficial exchange like you get in a free market.
So when Bernie sort of popped up on the radar as this guy who had been arrested in the 60s and had been consistent in his policies.
Bernie Sanders consistent in his policies? Yeah, not really. Let me give you an example of Bernie Sanders not quite being consistent in his policies. One thing that's always been a big part of Bernie Sanders' platform is a $15 an hour minimum wage. The fight for 15, as he called it. And a lot of Bernie Sanders supporters started rallying behind his whole fight for 15. Well, a lot of Bernie Sanders supporters and critics alike took notice to the fact that Bernie Sanders was paying his campaign staff less than $15 an hour. And of course, this kind of raises the questions: if Bernie Sanders believes that everyone in the country deserves to be paid at least $15 an hour, why isn't Bernie paying his campaign staff at least that much? What's wrong, Bernie? Why aren't you fighting for 15? So people kept calling him out on his hypocrisy, and eventually enough pressure was put on him that he finally raised the wages of his campaign staff to $15 an hour. And quite predictably, this led to Bernie Sanders having to either cut members off his campaign staff or roll back their hours. So kind of embarrassing for Bernie that when he was forced to put his money where his mouth is, our point ended up being proven.
Not only has he always advocated for healthcare.
Advocates for healthcare? Like, what does that even mean? Notice how a lot of what Emily's doing here is just throwing around vague platitudes that sound nice. Like, Bernie advocates for healthcare. Okay, well, what does he want to do with healthcare? Does he want to reform the healthcare system? Does he want to make it more affordable and accessible? Because, yeah, pretty much all politicians advocate for healthcare. Pretty much every politician on both sides of the aisle have some sort of healthcare aspect of their policy. What is it specifically that Bernie Sanders wants to do with healthcare that you support?
He's also always been on the right side as far as civil and humanitarian issues.
Yeah, the guy who's been on record supporting some of the most authoritarian regimes in history, such as Cuba, the Soviet Union, Venezuela, Nicaragua under control of the communists. Yeah, he's totally on the side of humanitarian issues.
Who is going to be speaking out for people who need someone to speak out for them?
I don't know, maybe people can speak out for themselves? And who are you to say whether or not other people need someone to speak out for them? You see, a lot of people on the left feel like they need to be the official spokesperson for all these different groups, and it somewhat comes across as condescending, like the people in those groups are somehow not able to advocate for their own interests on their own behalf. Like poor black people need rich white liberals to speak on their behalf. And it's actually pretty funny, when you look at most of the left-wing liberals who rally against the rich people being greedy, most of them are rich people. Most of these people who like shame Jeff Bezos are themselves politicians or celebrities who are pretty well off. We already know Bernie's a freaking millionaire, and Emily here is pretty well off. She's modeled for a magazine, she's been in movies and TV shows before, so I'd imagine that she's not struggling financially either. Maybe at the end of the day, poor and working class people can speak on their own behalf, They don't need super wealthy, hypocritical scumbags using them as political fodder under the guise of speaking on their behalf.
It just was like, this is our man.
Yeah, this is our man. The guy who advocates for stealing more money from people. The guy who advocates for forcefully intervening into voluntary arrangements with a gun. The guy who shames rich people for being too greedy, in spite of being insanely rich, and giving very little to charity himself. The guy who supports some of the worst authoritarian regimes in history, and to this day supports a bunch of failed socialist policies, and has to obscure or twist basic facts about history or economics to justify continuing to do so. The guy who's revealed himself to be, at best, a complete moron and at worst, a dishonest hypocrite. Yeah, sounds like the man I want in charge of my country.
Women in this country have so much to lose as far as healthcare.
Like what? What is it exactly that women have to lose in terms of healthcare? See, here's my biggest problem with this video. The arguments that Emily makes in favor of Bernie Sanders are very vague. You've probably noticed several times in this video she'll bring up a point and then offer very little in terms of elaboration. Like, women have a lot to lose in terms of healthcare. What does that mean? What do women have to lose? And how exactly is Bernie Sanders going to prevent them from losing it? Come on, get specific. If you're going to want people to stand behind what you're arguing for, we're going to need a little more elaboration in what you're offering.
This is a potential moment in the Supreme Court where Roe v. Wade could be overturned. So whoever's going to be our next Supreme Court justice will be up to the next president in the next 4 years.
Oh no, women won't be able to murder their own children before they're even born. Oh no, what a tyranny.
So it's very important to have someone who advocates for women's rights in position of power.
Well, Bernie Sanders has and continues to argue for forms of authoritarian socialism in which nobody of either gender really has any rights. But speaking about women's rights specifically, one of the things that Bernie Sanders and his supporters seem to be a big fan of is mandating employers to provide paid maternity leave. The supposed rationale that justifies this is that it facilitates women entering the workforce. I'd argue it actually has the opposite effect. Think about it for a second. If you're an employer, while hiring a female would then come with the risk of having to pay someone for several months for no productivity. What are the chances that you as an employer would want to hire a female in that situation?
Too many women have fought for too many years to make sure that women control their bodies, not the government. We're not going back.
Yet Bernie Sanders has absolutely no problem with the government controlling how much money you earn, how much money you get to keep, how you spend your money, what voluntary arrangements you make with other people. Bernie Sanders advocates for so much government control in so many other aspects of life that it comes across as very disingenuous for him to be against government control in this one particular situation when it comes to women being able to murder their own children. Give me a break.
Bernie has always been very clear about how he advocates for women's health care, which is hugely important to me.
I like how the aspect of women's health care that's most important to her is women being able to murder their own children. Not breast cancer treatment or maternity care. No, for her, the entire discussion around women's health care all comes down to abortion. Not to mention, if you actually look at what Bernie Sanders' plan for health care is, it's a bit bonkers. Now, the specific problems that UHC countries tend to have with their healthcare systems is a bit complicated, and there are plenty of other videos that thoroughly cover the issue, so I won't discuss it too much here. But even if you are someone who supports a government-run healthcare system, Bernie's plan is still a bit ridiculous. He literally wants to give the government a monopoly on providing healthcare. Like, if you actually read the M4A bill that Bernie Sanders wants to pass, it stipulates that everyone in the country must pay for this government-run healthcare plan through their taxes, and no private insurance company is allowed to offer a similar plan. So it literally gives the government a monopoly on healthcare. Like, I personally wouldn't necessarily be against a government-run healthcare program. You know, maybe there is an option for people who can't afford private healthcare, but giving the government a full-blown monopoly on healthcare is a step too far in my opinion.
I understand why sometimes it doesn't feel appealing to vote. And I think that's really important to talk about because a lot of people are like, how could people not vote? What's wrong with them?
You gotta vote to keep up the illusion that the people are in control. You gotta vote for one of two narcissistic megalomaniacs with no soul.
And I think it's, comes down to the fact that there aren't often candidates that represent the change that you want to.
Okay, yeah, there's actually some truth to this. I think the reason a lot of people are turned off from voting, or at least the reason I never vote, is because none of the options are ever any good. It's never a matter of which candidate is putting forth policies that are actually good. Both candidates usually put forth shitty policies, and that's why I never really feel compelled to vote.
See, they don't represent what you want for yourself, so it feels so distant and sort of unimportant.
That's because it's kind of impossible for a politician to represent what each individual person wants. Larken Rose mentions this in his video where he debunks the idea of representative government. But there's so many people living in society with such a vast variety of different needs and demands that there's no way a single person or even a council of people can adequately represent all of them. This is why people are much more likely to have their needs met by a voluntary free market system as opposed to a centralized coercive system.
That's not the case in this election. There's so much at stake here.
You know, this is something you hear people say every single election. Like, we know every other election the stakes weren't particularly high and both candidates sucked. But this time is different. Yeah, this one particular election is going to be somehow different from all the others. Yeah, sorry, but pretty much every election is going to be plagued with the same fundamental problems. Both candidates are bad, and the outcome is imposed on you whether you agree to it or not, meaning that none of the candidates have an incentive to be good.
And getting out to vote, your one vote makes a change.
Literally, the only situation in which your vote actually makes a change is if the election ends up tied. Like, that's literally the only scenario in which your vote is actually meaningful.
We will regret it forever if we don't take this opportunity to join this movement.
Actually, you'll regret it forever if Bernie had won. Like, thank God this guy dropped out of the race early in 2020, because I can only imagine the amounts of economic destruction he would have caused if he actually wound up in a position of power. That actually reminds me, there's this really cringy Paula Dice video where Paula Dice assumes that Bernie Sanders will become president one day. I may take a look at it at some point, because it is super cringy. Paid for by Bernie. Well, gee, there's a shocker. In this video, Emily Ratajkowski is claiming that she's endorsing Bernie Sanders, but I think it's pretty obvious what's actually going on here. Bernie wanted to get the attention of young men, so he got a hot swimsuit model whom a lot of them will probably recognize to vouch for his campaign. Bernie knew exactly what he was doing here. Don't even try to bullshit us. And the problem is, this strategy can only go so far. Sure, having an attractive young woman on screen might keep people's attention for a little bit, but if you want us to actually get on board with your campaign, you have to give us actual arguments. And it seems like most of this video is just vague platitudes. Thank God this guy dropped out. Anyways, as always, this has been Philosophos, making stupidity play dead. Until next time, take care.